Thanks so much for joining us at this Bright Blue event. I'm Kamal Ahmed. I'm the presenter of the Daily Tea podcast and columnist and director of audio for The Telegraph. But this is a very important conversation that we need to have around our future, our declining birth rate. Are we family friendly? Thank you very much to Bright Blue for this event in partnership with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The event is being live streamed and we will take questions at the end from you, our lovely audience. And I don't know if there is Slido, is there actually? I don't think there is Slido. Is there a Slido? There may be a Slido.
There is Slido, but people may not ask questions.
Okay, but we'll certainly get questions from in this room, which is the most important thing. So that's brilliant. Just a bit about Bright Blue. It's an independent think tank that seeks to defend and improve liberal society. Bright Blue's work focuses on four main themes: education, environment, social and employment policy, all of which, of course, are very much linked to the debate we're going to have here. Do tweet as we chat along if anything seizes your interest using the hashtag #BrightBlue, and do follow at @WeAreBrightBlue and also the Joseph Rowntree Foundation at JRF_UK. So we're just going to have a little opening thoughts from our brilliant panel to kick us off, and then opening up to a sort of slightly broader discussion. And given this is a lovely intimate room, it'd be really nice to involve everyone in that conversation after we've heard initial thoughts from the panel. But David Simmons, maybe I could come to you first, and just some of the questions that we want to answer here. Fewer adults becoming parents. How can the government best help reduce the pressures and costs of modern family life? What more should employers be doing and to enable employees to care for their families? And has this conversation, which I think is a very interesting part of what we're going to discuss today, sort of become slightly a preserve of the other side of the aisle, so to speak, in the debate, i.e. that the left has an argument for pro-family policies, which the right has found hard to maybe formulate in such a strong way. But David, kick us off. And congratulations, one of the 121.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much
Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner.
Thank you very much indeed.
Danny Finkelstein, I'm sure, voted for you.
Lord Finkelstein is one of my constituents and regularly shares his views. I would say it's a wonderful place to be a parent and to bring up a family. I think, Kamal, you're right in saying that on the other side of the aisle, they talk a lot about this issue. But it strikes me that they don't have any solutions. The challenges that we face as a country of a falling birth rate is a challenge which is shared by pretty much every other country in the developed world. And even further afield, if we look at countries like India, which now takes the top spot as the world's largest population, we're seeing, as people become more prosperous, a significant drop in family size and in birth rates as well. Now, on one level, that's quite an important step for humanity. We know that there were predictions about the size of global population and the environmental impact of that by mid-century and by the end of the century, which were a really big concern for previous political generations. But it's striking that we are now having a debate as a Conservative Party, and developed countries are having a debate about how do we get a better balance so that family size, population size becomes more self-sustaining, and what the connections are between that and our immigration debate. So we know that in order for a country's economy to be sustained, we need a certain level of skills, we need a certain level of population. We already know in the UK that a common piece of feedback from businesses is that they go out to recruit and they simply can't find workers with the necessary skills. The construction industry estimates that it's 370,000 workers short of the people required as a minimum to sustain our current level of house building, for example. And when we say that that's a big challenge that we need to address in this Parliament and in future as a party and as government, we clearly need to make sure that things like that size of skills deficit need to be addressed. So we need to make sure that we have a set of policies in place that support and encourage families. And what is also very striking is that when we look internationally, no country, whatever set of policies it has put in place, seems to have found a good fix to this problem. Just across the Channel in France, there is a huge public subvention to families, that, as well as free and obligatory childcare and education from what we would consider to be the early years, significant packages of support through things like benefits for families, we see exactly the same challenges around birth rate. And countries like Italy that were further ahead of us in going into seeing a major decline in birth rate are countries which traditionally have seen the support for traditional families as being a key plank of their political debate. So it seems very evident that we need to be cognizant of that. The other interesting development, of course, is that as a country and as a population, we are living longer. And the age at which we do many things in our lives is getting later and later. The traditional model that our parents and grandparents' generation would have expected and perhaps project upon us, that you leave school, leave university, 18 to 21, get married, buy a house, have some children. People are doing that in their late 30s and early 40s now. You're more likely to have a child for the first time aged over 40 than under 20. So there's been a big shift in the way lots of things that we do as a society are happening. So I don't think it seems to me that we've got a clear-cut solution. But one of the things that is very important is that we, as a party, I think, articulate that we value parenthood, that it's something that we see as important, that we want to send that message to couples, to men, to women, whatever sort of relationship they're in, that this is a country and a society which values parenthood and is looking to support them, so that people know as they contemplate that important decision that they are doing so in the context of a society and an economy where employment policies, childcare policies, education policies come together in a way that values that and puts it at the heart of our agenda for the future. And as we are here in opposition, we've got the opportunity to do some serious thinking about what the specific policy initiatives are that underpin each of those things like employment and education.
Thank you, David. David, does that outline of putting family more at the centre of policy rub up against the choice of people not to have children? I mean, obviously, if you look at Japan, if you look at South Korea, if you look at, to an extent, Italy, to France, as you say, they have been much more directive from the government. People should have more babies. And they've actually directed that that should be a policy, and they're giving bounties and financial incentives at the beginning of that journey that parents take with young babies. Where's the line for the Conservatives here? Because family is also a matter of choice. And I do wonder whether actually people are having fewer children for issues that can't be fixed because the trend is so powerful. It's almost like sometimes you're sort of standing with the tide coming in, trying to protect a sandcastle that ultimately won't be protected.
My children love sandcastles, so that feeling of the tide coming in is one that's very familiar. I don't think this is something to which there is no solution, but we have the benefit as a country of not being the first mover in this policy field. We can see and learn from the ideas that have been implemented in countries like Japan, and also we have the opportunity to look at what is going on in other countries and their economies and their societies that might give us some ideas. I think the point about the fact that we are living longer and therefore significant life decisions are happening later on is one where we do need to spend some time examining what the impact of that is. Because we know, particularly in respect of fertility, that there is a basic biological challenge around that which we need to consider. And everybody, all of us, are confronted with that reality as human beings. We also need to think about the way in which, as a global population that has expressed for generations huge worries about overpopulation. I remember the days of the Blair government and the huge investment in reducing teenage pregnancy, something which was successful in that it did significantly reduce the number of people who were having children when they were young. But what is the long-term social consequence of that? It was intended to address a perceived social ill, but has potentially changed the tone of some of the debate around family in a way that can be unhelpful. So I think we need to think about the way we as a society address the place that children and parenthood occupy. And it's also true to say, the UK has historically been seen as a country that's not very child or family friendly. We've from the Victorian seen and not heard idea of childhood, which occasionally as a Conservative Party we like to allude to as though we see it as a positive thing to return to. But we need to recognise that valuing childhood is something that we need to be sending positive messages about as a party and as a society as well.
Thank you, David. Dame Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining this event. Tell us a little bit, long career as a teacher, so very, very close up and personal with the journey of many, many children, many parents and policymakers in this area. Tell us about the role of the Children's Commissioner and also your thoughts on tackling this issue.
I will do, but I also want to start by being a bit more contentious and answering Bright Blue's initial homework question was as to whether the previous government had been family friendly enough, and my answer is absolutely not. No, and it was a massively missed opportunity because what I would have expected from the Conservative government, and I'm completely independent as Children's Commissioner, what I would, and I think what the nation would have embraced was a robust, positive support of family and children, and it could have helped things go a different way. And I feel very strongly about that. I asked a number of times for my role to be changed from Children's Commissioner to Children and Families Commissioner, because that would make far more sense of that role, and I feel really, really strongly about it. So yes, I was a teacher for 32 years, a head teacher for 20 years, in some of the most disadvantaged areas. I set up a number of free schools, academies up in the east of England, and became Children's Commissioner during just after lockdown. During lockdown, I realised I had dedicated my life to that kind of magic bullet of, you know, a great education, whatever background you come from, you can like have agency and create your own life. I'm from Scunthorpe Steelworkers' daughter. That was my story, and I wanted to give that to children. And you know, what a wonderful, fantastic time I had doing it, and a privilege I had doing that. But during lockdown, I realised we needed something different, something more. The solution, it had kind of really cracked at some of the foundations that was holding our society together, and the problems were going to be great, and indeed they are. We still have million plus children not back at school properly, you know, 100,000 plus. The arguments have been rehearsed. You know, a tsunami of mental health concerns among the young, and so and so. So when I became Children's Commissioner, I went out and did the Big Ask survey. What do you need to thrive, children going forward? What do you need for your future? And recently I've just done the Big Ambition survey. What do you want from the next government? So asking children and parents that. We've had 1 million responses. There are 8 million school-aged children, so that's a large cohort. And I'll tell you a few of the things that they said that are pertinent to hear. But just before I do, one of the things I did in 2022, Kemi Badenoch, as Women and Equalities Minister, asked me to run a family review. Do a family review to look at family across the nation and to advise government on it. And it was salutary, and it chimed absolutely with the Big Ask and the Big Ambition. What did we discover? We discovered that when you ask people in this country, whatever background they're from, what family means to them, their answer is everything. Love. We show the protective effect of family. Whatever background you are from, whether you're from humble origins like mine, whether you're on benefits, whatever, if you could rely on family, people's mental health and happiness was better. When families were in trouble and financial trouble, what we showed in that piece of work was the first place they wanted to turn was their family, from then friends, and then if they had to use services, they wanted those services to feel familial, local, and sustainable. The thing that matters the most to the people in this country, and why I think the Conservatives missed a trick, is family. It's the bedrock of our society. Now, what did the children say? Did they say anything different? So the first thing the children said, and that's 1 in 5 of them, said that those in power don't listen to them. So I thought that was quite interesting. We often talk about, the Conservatives are the party of the old. Well, actually, children's political first of all, that's such a false dichotomy. Conservatives need to be the party of the family. The old are not separated from their family. Who cares more for children than grandparents and uncles and those who have, you know, a stake in it? So first of all, I wanted to smash that. But the children, the other thing that came from talking to children was just how weak their political education is. So when I asked who's the Prime Minister, the answers would be Barack Obama. Boris had a bit of visibility. Yes, you'll be surprised. Where are they? Why do you think when I get a group of 30 children at the moment, this has only happened in the past few months, who do you support politically? Oh, Nigel Farage. Why? He's on TikTok. He's really funny. Like, in terms of communication with children and political ideas with children, there is a serious issue here that people need to think about. But with children, what mattered to them? When I asked them, what do you want for your futures? Look, I was hoping as a teacher, they'd appreciated reading Dickens and want an intellectual future. No, they want great jobs. And that meant different things to different children. I met the next few prime ministers, but I also met children who wanted great jobs in their local areas. They want great jobs. They want family, a happy family life. The millennial cohort, my analysts went into that millennial cohort study and looked at children who, are now 25, 24, 25. 50% of them did not live with both parents and had changed. Now, when we're going to talk about policy later, but when we describe and define and try to understand family in our country, we're totally missing it with the census data. Children see family as their uncles, their aunts, their grandparents, and they've experienced massive instability. So it is not surprising to me that they put family and having a good family life as one of their top priorities. And just to finish, I think this summer, we're not talking about it, but we should be. We had riots up and down this country. I was in Southport last week and went to the Spello Library that was burnt down and sat with children and talked to them about, how they felt about that. I will meet every child who's received a custodial sentence for rioting. Because as Children's Commissioner, I get to meet every child in prison. And I can tell you now, they will not tell me, I bet my bottom dollar, they won't be saying, I had a really happy family life. I had great things to do, in my youth club or out of school, a really good community, and I go to school every day. They won't be telling me that. And to prepare, I flew over to Norway. Now, Norway is like the Nordic countries. They tax everyone to bits, and they've got the sovereign capital fund, But the thing I took away from my Norway visit, and literally the scales fell away from my eyes, is everywhere I went, and I went everywhere. I met the 10 children in prison in Norway. We have 420 with 1,000 whose liberties have been restricted. They've got fewer than 10. I met police chiefs. I met everyone. Health, The value of childhood. And in response to your thing, we have to do better. And that's what I'd hoped the Conservatives would have gone out and campaigned on. Childhood matters. Mothers matter. Allowing mothers to be with their children if they want to be matters. Making sure that if they need to work, there's suitable support for them matters. These are the policies that I want to see the Conservatives in opposition championing with real moral force. And don't be squeamish about someone's done something wrong in their private life so we can't talk about family, or someone's going to say something on Twitter. Forget it. Do what the people of this nation really want, which is support the thing they care about, which is family.
Rachel, do you get a sense from the 4 candidates, some of whom have put family into some of their prospectus of what they're talking about, that they understand that there may be lack of family-friendly policies over the period they led or were in government is a negative for them? Are you hearing that in this period, as David says, they have now a period to think about what is their prospectus for the public, that family will become more visible? Because it is interesting, isn't it? If you look back at political history, I've been sort of following as a journalist, political government since 1992, and Conservatives and family were always very closely linked. But your reminder is a very good one that more recently, I don't feel I've heard that type of conversation from the Conservatives. Do you think that the penny is dropping slightly?
I I hope so. I think there are two bits of advice I'd give, which is don't do government by Twitter or policy by Twitter. Like, forget, you've got to, we need some moral purpose and some vision, right? So worrying about popularity and things, that's just ridiculous. I think secondly, I think for so long people have been saying, oh, the Treasury can only do this, or we can do this project and we put, £500,000 or a couple of million into this. That's just rubbish politics. Things get done because ministers and governments believe it's the right thing to do. I've given up going to ministers and saying, please, could you just give me this tiny little thing? Actually, I want to go to them and say, children matter, families matter, and it's your job to do something about that. And that's what I need to see from the candidates. I hope there'll be a boldness, especially in opposition. Especially in opposition. There's a new government that's just moving from campaigning to delivery. It feels, it's starting to move. This is a time I would have liked to have come to this conference. I mean, I've been here for 2 days. This is my last meeting, but I would have liked to have come and heard, we're going to do this. We believe in this. We're going to challenge government on this. Because for me as an independent, great government is when you've got a strong government trying to do things and an opposition, who are red in teeth and claw and fighting back with ideas. And that's what I want to see. So I think I've given you my answer there.
You have. You must be delighted that one of the few stories to break through at this conference is Kemi Baden not suggesting that maternity pay was too strong a regulation and should be looked at. That's not exactly the direction of travel that you're encouraging then. What did you think of her comments?
So I haven't really looked into, I did see it in the Bayway. I don't know whether she's been misrepresented. Kemi did actually ask me to do the family review, and I know has some passionate sort of views around sort of outcomes and certainly outcomes sort of things. I mean, I think all the candidates need to grasp this nettle about family unashamedly and need to start supporting women, children, fathers, society, and creating the country that...
But presumably, she was clear. I mean, I read, reread, and carefully looked at her words. She put on the table that maternity pay was an issue, even if it was only that it was an overcomplicated regulations for business. And she said it was excessive. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. And actually, what I have found as an employer, so I've been an employer since 2005, as an academy principal and then running a group of schools. My working mothers, I would bend over backwards to give them the space and the time and to let them come back part-time in their own space, because I'd get 25 times more passion and commitment out of them over the years if you really support in that time when you are vulnerable when you're pregnant. You are vulnerable when you first have a child. What's the first thing we're saying to women after 6 weeks? When you're coming back to work, we should be saying, how can we support you? You are doing this amazing job for having children, the most important job, and we need to support you. And in fact, I was looking around. I was looking at one East European country, 3 years maternity leave, because they value it so much.
Do you think we should have 3 years maternity leave?
I certainly think giving women the space to have their families and finding a way to work around that is really, really important. I took a number of years off and worked part-time, made huge sacrifices in my family life in terms of living with my wider family. And I look back now 30 years later, and it's the best thing I did, and been enabled to do that and been in a profession, in education, that allowed me to go back part-time, work as I needed to, was just a really good investment, I hope people would think.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that passion. That was brilliant. So, Patrick Spencer, the challenge has been laid out before you. 14 years. You simply haven't been successful in supporting families and talking about families in a way that Rachel has encouraged you. You are the Shadow Parliamentary Undersecretary for Housing, Communities and Local Government. David, you raise a lot of things that are on Patrick's patch. Oh, you're not. No, that's what it has here. But okay, sorry, that's you. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
You're a lot of your things. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Patrick. Sorry.
That's the
You
fastest
can have his
promotion I've ever experienced.
sorry.
Ever.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
David, that's you right. But Patrick, just respond to the challenge that has been put for the Conservatives and pro-family policies.
I'll start by saying I'm not involved in the housing brief. My job
Sorry for
before I
information.
came to the House of Commons was as the family policy advisor to the Conservative government in the Department for Education, where I worked closely with Rachel and closely with Juliet, who's sitting in the audience. So we've actually got a large portion of the family policy cohort of the last couple of years. So get it off my chest. I absolutely agree. The Conservatives dropped the ball on family policy over the 14 years. We dropped the ball on loads of things. And I absolutely agree that we don't do enough to talk about family and the importance of family. The reality is we're a political party and we reflect the cultural trends that you see in society. And the reality is we've got to accept that there has been a cooling attitude towards the traditional institution of family and marriage and having children with someone you're married to and remaining together and living, making sure children live with biological parents. It's not just a, metro trendy woke issue in our urban areas. There has broadly been, and this was touched on, I think, by an academic in America called Isabel Sawhill, in a book called Generation Unbound, where she said one of the cultural trends of the latter part of the 20th century was a disconnection between sex and marriage. There has now been a complete disconnection between marriage and having children. And that's the reality. I'm personally not of faith, but I think a lot of people point to the decline of organized religion and faith-based attendance as one of the drivers of this trend. But the reason I bring it up is twofold. It is not surprising that when I pushed Conservative ministers to talk about the importance of family, sometimes even the importance of marriage, I didn't push it as hard, but pushing the importance of family, pushing the importance of being there for children, the absolute wonders, you got ministers looking at you going, but no one cares. And Rachel's going to tell me that it's not true, but the sense and the feel from the politicians is that, coming out with strong family statements, pro-family statements, it appeals to a certain section of the Conservative Party, but it doesn't appeal widely. And the reality is our political discourse has moved completely away from it. I remember going to an event with another lesser-known think tank that will remain nameless, where it was, I think it was Alison McGovern who stood up and said, being pro-family could be construed, or certainly being pro-marriage, said being pro-family could be construed as homophobic. I struggled to make that leap as well. I know I'm lost. I sat there kind of thinking, how on earth is that the case? But like I said, the reason I bring it up is it is difficult for politicians to talk about family in a way that I would like them to. And it's on me, hopefully, to use my career in a different manner. The reason I think it's important, and getting back to the meat of this discussion, is, and it was amazing because I couldn't believe I wouldn't have believed you if you said the biggest topic of conference so far would be maternity leave, but it has been. I think my attitude towards maternity leave is that yes, it absolutely should be more generous. We should be absolutely doing more to make paternity leave more generous. And why should that be the case? Because children benefit hugely from having parents around in the early days. The biggest risk to a child's outcomes is family breakdown in the first couple of years. And the first couple of years of a child's life tend to be the most strenuous. For those of us who have gone through it, we all know how difficult those early years are. And the reality is, if we want children to do well at school, if we want them to go on and get jobs, if we want to have a thriving economy and a strong society, we have to get the early years right. And that means giving parents who have got children under the age of preschool age children as much support as we possibly can. I'm not calling for a massive enlargement of the state. I'm saying we should cut money from other parts of our welfare state, and we should throw money at the younger children. To cite another American academic, Jim Heckman, the Heckman curve is still the gold standard of understanding the best return on investment in welfare, which is the earlier you spend money on children, the higher the outcome and the better off they are. That I think the child benefit bill is ludicrously large, and we give people not a huge amount of money to support 13, 14 and 15-year-olds. When in fact what we should be doing is giving younger parents huge increases in support because they really, really need it. I'll finish off by probably touching on the one point that I really wanted to get. If we're serious about solving poverty and boosting social mobility in this country, it starts with the family. There is a direct link between experience in the criminal justice system, being stuck in a cycle of addiction, money problems, homelessness, with family breakdown, experience at a young age, and childhood trauma, which is, as a result, broadly, of family breakdown. If we really want, this is David's area of specialisation, really, as a former DCS, but if we really, really want to tackle problems of entrenched poverty, it's got to start by supporting families to stay together. And that is, we can give them jobs and build more social housing and all of this stuff, which is good. But unless we crack the family problem, we won't make headway. Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Barry. Isn't the problem that the public don't actually want to hear from politicians about family, given that one of your previous prime ministers seemed to struggle to know how many actual children he had, or wouldn't be able to say? I mean, frankly, Rachel, I take your point about the conversation, the necessity of the conversation, but is it actually politicians to have that conversation, given the inability sometimes of politicians to behave in a way that the public think is the right way to behave? To Patrick.
I guess I arrived in the Department for Education in 2020, somewhere around there. So yes, we had a prime minister at the time who had a fairly flexible attitude towards his marriage and his children and various other things. But
I think it is. I think I don't want to make it it sounded a bit of a cheap one. I didn't mean it quite like that. I mean, is it politicians who people want to hear from? I think, Rachel, there could be other players, which actually we're going to bring in now, actually. But I think there's a point there, isn't there?
I think our politics at the moment is around retail offers on the cost of living, housing. What are you delivering for me that will change my real life? The problem with talking about family is it is quite academic. And talking about the importance of being there in the early years and supporting children and breastfeeding and reading to them and developing their prefrontal cortex, as Andrea Ledson would often refer to. All of those things are a tad academic, and so they don't fit into a tweet.
Yes, they don't, and as you were saying, Rachel, don't govern by tweet. Abhi Jitendra, you're the Principal Policy Advisor on Care for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We've heard very robust critique of the Conservative Party years. Just give us an outline of where you and the foundation are in terms of how we maybe will be able to change the tone on family-friendly, whatever that may mean. And will that then be connected to a change in fertility rates? Because my at least suggestion is that whatever maybe people on this fantastic panel do, that fertility rate is going in one direction because people are going to be having fewer babies because of many, many complicated and intertwined lifestyle choices.
Thank you so much. And it's just so brilliant to see so many people here. And I just want to thank Bright Blue again for doing work on this way before we partnered with you guys. So it's just really, really brilliant to see the interest. I think I'll just frame that question by talking just a bit about what sort of care means, I think, to all of us. So I think care, as Rachel said so eloquently, is clearly just a very deeply sort of personal choice. And care and families are obviously really interrelated. And these choices are really bound up with our identities, with our histories, and expressing these choices freely, I think, and we think at the Foundation, should be an aspiration of any sort of developed country, and definitely should be an aspiration of the United Kingdom. And I'm really surprised that on this panel we haven't yet talked about what I think is one of the biggest sort of achievements of the Conservative government, or the previous Conservative government, which is the childcare expansion, which Rishi Sunak announced in March 2023. And I think that is massively something to be proud of, because if we want to give people the choice to have a family, to pursue the career that they want, to have a balance between work and care, then actually good state subsidised childcare is a really central part of that. So, you know, I obviously it was sort of defined in terms of people's ability to work, but it's also a massively impactful way to help women get back into the workplace, which we know that many of them want to. We've also got a system of leave policies. Kamal, you mentioned the maternity gate, which is obviously a really big discussion now because of Kemi Badenoch's comments. I don't think you'll be surprised to know that I think maternity pay is one of another thing that we need to be massively proud of, because it's one of the most strong ways to keep women in the labour market. But we also have a real deep wish from parents to actually do caring themselves, which is what kind of maternity leave allows women to do, at least in the earliest years. So we've been doing some research with parents and people with experience of caring, and we found that 2 in 5 parents who cared primarily for their children did it primarily because they wanted to, not because they were forced to, not because they couldn't find the right childcare, but because they literally wanted to. It was a really central part of their family life, their wish for their lives and their future, and their wish for their children. But we also know that caring can be financially ruinous. JRF does lots of studies on poverty and destitution. We have found recently that 1 million children are in destitution, and we also have known time and time again, also from the work that Patrick's previous employer, CSJ, have done, that larger families tend to be in poverty more readily. We also ran the numbers on the motherhood penalty more recently, and we found that a woman who has a child loses £100,000 over the 6 years following the birth of her child from lost wages. So people are caring more, they're working more, and that's really hard. So maybe it's not that surprising that people are making the decision to have children later, or possibly not have children at all. I don't have children for that exact reason yet. So, you know, I'm speaking from a very personal place on that one. And I do think we're talking about parenting here, but actually caring exists across your life cycle. You might be caring for your children. You might also be caring for your spouse or your elderly parents. And we estimated that in the next 10 years, we are going to need 900,000 more unpaid carers in our society just to meet that demand for unpaid care in the future. And just a note on politics, our research also looks at the salience of care amongst voters. And the thing we find time and time again is that if you've got experience of caring, if you're a parent or an unpaid carer, care is pretty high up the things you care about. It tends to go, you know, health, cost of living, maybe some environment or immigration, and then caring for your friends and family. If you're not a carer, if you don't have any experience of care, it's way down. It's like 10th, 12th on the list of things that you care about. Basically, everything else is more important, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for why that is. But if we're going to rely on, the voters themselves or the majority to tell us what to do to solve the problem, I'm just not sure that is going to work. So I think it will need political leadership. And so that's really brilliant to hear from MPs like Patrick that this is something that they really care about. So what do I think politicians from across the political spectrum need to be thinking about? The future of work is increasingly about the changing face of care and families. And so we need to think really centrally about how you can work and care at the same time. So that means flexible work. It means childcare that is readily available. It means leave policies across the life cycle, including a more generous paternity leave offer, which is just so important to in the early years to inculcate and get a sense that men and women both care for children, and that is something that we need to change culturally as well. And we've also called for something called statutory care pay, which is a new kind of leave benefit to help you care for the elderly or infirm, which currently doesn't exist. And given we're going to see an aging population, that is, I think, one of the next big crises in our sort of work and care policy framework. And more broadly, we just need the government to care about you caring for your children yourself. The government increasingly cares about childcare, and we have what the IFS calls a new branch of the welfare state with the childcare expansion. But does the government really care about you looking after your children yourself and having the freedom to do that, the choice to do that? I don't think so, and that is something that really needs to change. So yeah, I'm really glad we're having this discussion and keen to hear more.
Thanks so much. On the issue, so Patrick made the point that the focus should be on supporting families. Some of those things will need extra payments, but they should not mean the overall welfare cost goes up. There's a big discussion, obviously, within the Conservative Party and here that the state is too big, that expenditure on public services is too high. Are you with Patrick that take from others to supply more to support families, and particularly those early years, and particularly those with caring responsibilities? Or do you believe that actually the state needs to just be more involved in paying to support families?
I think a few different things in this space. So I think the child benefit question is a really interesting one, because you can actually change that policy without spending a penny. You can literally just take the child benefit that we pay to all eligible children and just front load it in the early years. It's a policy discussion that seems to come back like every few years, but I think it's a brilliant idea to get the sort of return on investment that the Heckman curve sort of points to, and as I said, that wouldn't cost any money at all. But I guess I'd push a bit deeper, because I guess the conversation that we're having in this room and on this panel is a slightly deeper one than about immediate costs. We're talking about a moral imperative to think about how people live a good life, and the kind of relationship between the state, society, and its people. And so, I think that if we are to prioritise anything, it should be families, children in the early years, and care. And that is hopefully going into the sort of meat grinder of priorities and policies that are being discussed at this conference, and obviously happening in the government as well.
Here's a harder Here's a harder policy dilemma. Do we sacrifice universal free school meals and say the money would be, which is a really popular idea, but ultimately takes away the responsibility of feeding your children and gives it to the state? Do we sacrifice that in the name of being pro-family and in the name of reallocating budget towards front-loading child benefit? Because I don't know many people of the left or of the centre ground who would abide by the idea of absolute. I mean, I was in the department when we pushed it back against Marcus Rashford, and my goodness, did we fall foul of public opinion on that occasion.
Yeah, very difficult. Ryan Shorthouse, could I bring you in, Executive Chair of Bright Blue? And David, I will come back to you then after that. Ryan, it is interesting that your key themes, education, environment, social and employment, seem to be so linked to this debate, which I think is the underpinning. And as others have said, you've been at the forefront of this, maybe before some others have been quite as loud. Ryan, give us the overview from sort of Bright Blue's perspective on what should happen in this space.
So I think the starting point is that most of what politicians say is noise to the public. So sorry, David. So I don't think the issue is that we need to hear politicians talk more about the family. I don't think there is a cultural problem of people in this country not prioritising family. I think what matters more is, do they deliver on policies that support families? And that is what the public are judging them on, not that politicians are moral leaders that set the debate on the importance of family. And it goes to a wider debate about how do we support more people to start families, and sustain it? Is it about the culture, or is it about the socio-economic climate that people are in? And I don't think it is culture, because if you look at survey evidence, Rachel has already talked about it, most people, above everything else, prioritise the family. It is still a universal ideal, near universal ideal, for people to want to get married and to have children. The marriage rate, yes, is down, although I would say of the marriages that are happening, there's fewer divorces. The divorce rate is down. People spend more time with their children who are under the age of 5 than they ever have done. So there's time use surveys which tracks how people spend their time. Oxford University have done it. People are, particularly women, are working more than they used to in the day, but are also spending more time with their children. And there's lots of evidence suggests that actually what's being squeezed out is the time for community and voluntary activity. It's not the work and the family time. And actually, there's a very good essay by David Brooks in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, who actually says we shouldn't be lamenting the decline of the nuclear family. Actually, that's pretty exceptional in the post-war period. Actually, it was the extended family which we should be lamenting, that relatives and friends are not nearby and providing that support, which I thought was quite interesting. And Boom, Phoebe, who is unfortunately ill, but she's part of Boom, and Anvar, who's in the audience, has been part of it. They did a really interesting study looking at the birth rate in different countries and how that correlates with the level of social conservatism. And there is no correlation. So more social conservative countries don't necessarily have higher birth rates. Again, I think reinforcing this idea that it's not really about culture. I think really it's about the policies that are in place that enable people to achieve their aspiration of wanting to start a family, to get married. That's, I think, the foundational principle for Conservatives are that is what people's aspirations are. Let's give them the choices to be able to do that. And also, as Abby was saying, the foundational principle for Conservatives should be, how they want to raise their children, particularly in the early years, should be about giving them as much choice as possible to do what they think is in the best interests of their child. And I think that comes to a wider point about conservatism, which is, I think it's at its most inspiring when it is defending the best institutions in life, whether that's home ownership, business ownership, having a family, but it is committed to widening access to those institutions to as many people as possible. So Thatcher was very good at widening home ownership and business ownership. Cameron was quite good, for example, at widening access to marriage through same-sex marriage. And I think that's when conservatism is at its best. So, I think we need to stop thinking we need to talk about families more and actually deliver for them in terms of the policies that are in place. So things I would consider are, for example, higher statutory maternity pay. It is about 180 quid a week. There's lots of evidence that low and middle income women in particular go back to the labour market sooner than they'd like because of that. I don't understand Kemi's view that statutory maternity pay is an excessive regulation because the government pays it almost in full. In fact, it pays over to small businesses. It's just paid through the payroll. So actually what's wrong about it is the first 6 weeks is 90%, which is completely covered by the government. So actually the government is subsidising employers like KPMG who pay very high salaries to particular women, and they're getting 90% of the pay. Actually, it'd be interesting whether we look at taking some of that money, capping it, and having a higher base rate which kicks in after 6 weeks, which will help more low-income women. The transferable tax allowance, I don't think is a good policy to incentivise marriage. I don't think that small amount of money is going to make a difference, but it does help one-earner couples. So I would think about extending it to more, not just married couples, but all couples where one partner leaves the labour market to look after children. I'd even also consider transferring it, being able to be transferable to grandparents. So if grandparents leave the labour market, then maybe their adult children who are looking after children can receive that tax allowance from the grandparent who goes to look after the grandchild. And I also agree with Patrick, the most acute financial pressure
is in the early years of a child life. Let's allow parents to front load child benefit to give them extra resource then. I'd also, and we called for this back in 2015 when we first started as a think tank, which was allowing shared parental leave to be transferred to grandparents if mum and dad did not use the whole entitlement. George Osborne in 2015 said, great policy, we'll implement it. It still hasn't been implemented for some reason. So I'd like to see that. And then finally, just on childcare. So I think some of the policies which I've suggested there would be very particularly useful for one-earner couples and people who want to stay at home. And I do think the government's done quite a lot on childcare support, and it would balance out with that would be balanced out with some of the things that I've just mentioned. And I don't think it's a zero-sum game. So just because you give childcare support doesn't mean you're taking away from stay-at-home parents. You can support both. But on childcare, there's still an issue around affordability, despite the extension of the free entitlement. I think two things to consider. One is just as students who go to university can get a loan, which they then pay back on an income contingent basis to afford to go to university, maybe on top of the support that parents get from government, they could also access a loan, which then allows them to smooth those quite high childcare costs over a time. And very poor parents would be protected because there would be a minimum income threshold when you start repaying. And I think the other thing to consider in the childcare market is that there is a lot of private contribution into childcare. There's also a lot of public contribution in recent years, but still the fees are one of the highest in the world. We have quite a lot of for-profit childcare providers, and if you compare that to other parts of the education system, which is dominated by not-for-profit, both at university and school level. So I'm interested in whether we could think about how we incentivise more not-for-profit status organisations in the childcare market, because I think that may help a little bit. I mean, it's certainly the case at the top end that private equity is now investing in childcare. So I think we need to think...
And in care homes, yeah.
And in care homes. So I think we need to think very carefully about that. So that's just, some what we should be actually doing rather than just saying, which is, I think, should be...
Is it surprising to you, Ryan, that politicians don't just get on with some of these things, given that you've been talking about this for many, many years, and you can go right back to nearly a decade ago with George Osborne saying, yeah, that's a good idea. We seem to be spinning our wheels often, and it's politicians that aren't acting on what seems simple. I particularly like the ideas I've heard around the table for your point on child benefit. This is not all about let's have more money for X and let's have more money for Y. It's about being smarter about the way we use the money we have. Why my lovely
Well, I think
colleagues-
it's a wider question actually about the relationship between politics and media and the incentives that some politicians get from saying things which are controversial and outspoken. And that's to do with the relationship between politics and media and the incentives that you get from that, rather than keeping your head down and actually getting on with the job and delivering. It's interesting that somebody like Liz Truss, for example, became Prime Minister, who I don't think necessarily had a great track record in delivery on many areas, but was brilliant at courting the media and getting a lot of media attention. Probably a debate for a different panel.
We should look to ourselves maybe sometimes.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily just the media, but I think there was an interesting thing about the relationship between politicians and the media, how the media cover politicians and how politicians relate to the media is...
David, let's have some questions, but David, a quick brief before I know you're trying to get in, but there's a lady at the back to get some questions, and two, actually, and three. But David,
Ryan and Abby have been, as always, some brilliant ideas.
Do you agree with Kemi Badenoch about excessive maternity pay regulations?
No, I don't, but I think there is an underlying point. We mustn't forget 70% of people in employment in the UK are in an enterprise with less than 5 staff. So for the KPMGs, as Ryan described, the system works quite well. But for most people, their employer is a small organisation, and managing that process is more challenging. But I want to just raise the point. I think firstly, in terms of did we make any progress in the last 14 years, the key thing which David Cameron set out, and his successors continued, was the way to improve children's lives was to make sure they were growing up in households where parents were working. And if we look at that record, there were 800 jobs created on average for every day of the last Conservative government, 4.5 million more people in work than there were in 2010. Youth unemployment today is half what it was in 2010. So the priority of getting people into households in a better economic situation was indeed met. But I think, Patrick's point, and I think Rachel's point as well, we spend too much of our money in big secondary schools, who are a huge vested interest in our education system. If we spent that money in the early years, we would make a transformatively better progress on outcomes. But none of our secretaries of state, and I think our system generally, has been willing to go through the political pain of all those head teachers saying, your child's doing their GCSEs and I'm having to lay off staff in order that the nursery down the road gets more money. And I think sometimes as a political system, not just in Parliament but everywhere, we need to be more realistic about those things. We know that spend on the early years has the biggest outcome. That is not at all reflected in what we do with our money, and we need to challenge those kind of vested interests.
Brave. Lady at the back there, yes, hand up. Two people at the back and then gentleman here, yes.
Just quickly, I'm a Conservative councillor at Wandsworth and I represent a ward that is known as London's original Nappy Valley. And I'm just
Which one is that?
Northcote in Battersea. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the sort of the post-2015 David Cameron with sort of or George Osborne getting to grips with childcare. Let's face it, Ed Miliband was too. That's one of the reasons. Because if you go back to 2010 in the Conservative-led coalition, many of us who had our first children around that time saw the end of our childcare vouchers, saw our child benefit removed, and actually it's very hard to square with mothers, and our children are still at school, that a Conservative government would deliver for all of us. Because, for example, on child benefit, for those that stayed at home and looked after their children, they also lost their pension contributions. So I find it an interesting debate that Rishi Sunak has done this fantastic thing, but for many years, under the coalition in particular, many of us were not able to get on and our children suffered. Thank you.
Brilliant. Another point there at the back. Thank
Hiya,
you. I don't even meant to have a mic, I'm so sorry.
It's all right, I'll just
People
talk
can hear
loudly.
you. Yeah.
I'm Alexandra from Gingerbread, the single parent family charity, also single parent to a daughter who is nearly 3. So I just wanted to say, I don't think it's always helpful to demonise single parent families, as I've heard a little bit of on the panel. We do exist, and actually we saw some really great policies for single parent families after the last under the last Conservative government, in particular with regards to the child maintenance service. So I just want to know what kind of things you might do now you're in opposition to support, a family that do make up 25% of families, and also just recognising that family breakdown is not the only reason why someone will become a single parent. So to hear that I'm potentially making things a lot more difficult for my daughter is quite difficult and uncomfortable.
Okay, brilliant.
Can I just come back?
Yeah, we'll come back. We're just going to do this in a second. Yeah. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm just going to that.
Yeah.
I'm Russell Gulf. I'm part of the National Foundation, but also helped Phoebe to start Boom. My question is quite a simple one. There's a lot of focus on there's discussions on panel about kind of the threat of kind of forcing people to have babies and how that's kind of how badly they're placed. But the problem is that things the data we have now, lots of people who want to have children are not able to have children. There's a very large gap in between intentions and between what people actually have. And there's lots of policy and intervention which can be done to address it. My question is simple. Why is there not more focus on the gap on childcare intentions, on child intentions, rather than on this fear of threat of forcing people to have children?
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Patrick, you wanted to come in on the issue about single parents. You've heard as well channeling your inner Rachel, frankly, about the failures of Conservative Party policy on families since 2010. So a bit more of that, but give your response on this.
I would love to really address the point about if you are pro-family or in some way pro-family formation and concerned about the risk of family breakdown, you're somehow anti-single mother. That couldn't be further from the truth. And can I be blunt? I think it really, really reduces this really important political and policy debate, and it makes us all a slightly worse off place. What ifs are the worst thing in policy. If you're pro-family, you can't. You're being you're neglectful of single parents. That, by the way, this is exactly what a Conservative Secretary of State threw back at me when I asked him to talk about family breakdown. I'm not directing this at you specifically. I got much angrier with him. But just to your second point about you're somehow to blame, or family breakdown is the cause of you being in a single parent family. That's not where I'm trying to go with this point. The majority of people who are separated, when we polled this at the CSJ, said that they didn't want to be separated and they would have liked to have had support to support their partner or their relationship or their marriage. And as a child of divorced parents, by the way, I can attest to that being true. There should be nothing wrong with me piping up and saying we should be doing absolutely everything to support people stay in relationships. It doesn't mean I'm not concerned about domestic violence. It doesn't mean I think we should ban divorce. It doesn't mean I think we should live in shame if you parent children outside of wedlock. No one wants to take Britain back to that place, but please let us get on with a debate on how we can support healthy, happy families without making it like, well, you're dissing single mums, because I really don't want to.
Very well time. So I would love brief comments from everyone on those questions and issues that were raised. Rachel, this issue that was raised about the desire for people to have children and the fact of them having children, there is a gap between those two numbers. What are we supposed to do about that?
It's so interesting because obviously I get to visit services for children all over the country, and I'm often going to say visit a family hub or a hospital, and invariably it's the teachers or the nurses or the professionals who are chasing me down the path saying the cost of childcare is ridiculous, the cost of mortgages are ridiculous. And I think given that, I think we have to acknowledge just how difficult it is to form a family, buy a house, the cost of mortgages, the cost of living. We have to recognise that and deal with it. And I think that is, but I am hopeful, looking at international comparisons and looking at things, although there aren't standouts, what I think we can do is chip away at policies that can make things better and give people hope. And we could come up with a great big list of them, and people have tried. But I think we should and we must support and encourage the people who want to have children and the people who want to stay at home with their children. And every little bit helps. So whilst I was talking about a revolution in the way that we think about this and the value we put on this, that in terms of the policy environment, I'm not in any way looking down my nose at each of those little things that make a difference, because they do. All the things that you said, they might not set my world on fire, but they will work and help.
Great, thank you, Rachel. David.
So I think this has been a really interesting session. I think we've seen lots of good ideas put forward. I'm not sure that we've addressed the central concern which underlies the debate, which is the falling birth rate and what do we do about that, because I think all the ideas that have been put forward are good ideas and we definitely should look at them and implement them. But we also know that other countries that have already done that, it's not had the impact on the birth rate. So I think there is something there that we are not quite getting at as a society that we need to think about. And it's really interesting. If I look at housing, which is in my shadow ministerial portfolio, we hear a lot of people say, I'm waiting to start a family until I can afford to buy a home. And the cost of it is a big issue. We also know there are something like 700,000 children who are overcrowded in temporary accommodation. So on one level, the evidence of what's going on in the housing system is that the constraint on supply of housing is not deterring people from having families and having large families. But at the same time, a whole other group in society isn't starting a family at all because they're worried about the housing situation. I think that's an example where we need to really get underneath what it is that's driving people's decision-making. But I just want to say, I'm very grateful to colleagues. I think we've seen some really interesting ideas put forward. And slightly to push back on what Ryan said, I think as well as the policy ideas, it is important that we continue to talk about and debate this, not just in the sense of, here are my specific proposals to officials, to government, to the party, of what we should implement. But let's make sure that we as a party are showing that we are interested in family and parenthood and childhood, and that we are keeping abreast of all the new ideas that are coming forward. We've got probably 4 years in opposition. We don't need to decide here and now what our policy proposition is going to be. We need to use that time to learn from the best that's out there.
Thank you so much, David. Abby, some final thoughts, thinking particularly about some of the things that were raised in the room.
Definitely, and really echo that it's been a really, really interesting discussion. And I just hope that the Conservatives use this opportunity in opposition to really sort of toss these kind of ideas around, because as I said, the future of work is the future of care, because they are so interconnected. The future of family is really interconnected with the future of work as well. So we sort of can't really help but think about this. I would just, I guess, double down on just the kind of choice argument that I guess we've been making on this side of the table. David is obviously right that we haven't seen, a silver bullet that will increase the number of babies somehow. But we do know that if we give people the choices to be able to express their kind of wishes, we're at least giving people the best shot to at least to have more children, to build a family. I mean, at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I think that the birth rate itself is not our central concern. It's very much the kind of living standards of families when they are here. And so I would just come back to the gingerbread question, that actually the policies that we've been talking about, I think I might disagree slightly with you, Rachel, that the policies that we've been talking about, if implemented in full, would be a radical transformation for the lives of families, and particularly single parent families, because we know that the early years, like child benefit, childcare, these are all issues that massively, overly support families who are struggling, larger families and single parent families. So, we should really focus on the policy detail that will have that change. I think that's all I've got.
Right. Ryan, I know we're just over time. It's been such a fantastic conversation, so thank you for that. But Ryan, just give us a few final thoughts from Bright Blue, who thank you very much for this really, really good and deep and rich conversation.
Yeah, great. Just on the first question, which I think was suggesting that there's maybe not enough support for one-earner couples. And it is the case that, for example, the child benefit is withdrawn now above 60,000. But say you've got two people on 50 grand and then a one-earner couple who's on 80 grand. The first couple gets the child benefit, the second doesn't. And then also with the free entitlement, over 100 grand, which is the free hours for childcare, you don't get it. So two people on 90k can get it, one person on 110 can't get it. And actually the IFS have done some analysis. You're better off if you've got two children in childcare being on 90 grand than you are on 120k. I mean, it's ridiculous. The government actually said under Rishi Sunak, the last budget, that he would get HMRC to be able to access household, not just individual income, was interested in doing that. And I think that may help in terms of where the thresholds are and not penalising one-earner couples. And I think that's very important. Just a final thing. I've talked a lot about money, and I'm not just a materialist. I'm also an old romantic at heart. Yeah. And I think, the most lovely sound is the sound, particularly for me, is the sound of my own children playing outside. And what is really important is that we have places and spaces for children. And I think Boom, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anvar, but there was a particular town in Japan or Korea which actually created spaces and facilities which were particularly targeted on children. So it's a very child-friendly town. And that is also as important, and that really helped drive up the birth rate, and more parents went there and more people had children. So it's not just about the money, it's also about the culture. And we need, those terrible signs, no ball games, for example, outside of states. We need children outside. Yes. We need to reduce the traffic in those areas. Yeah. We need to make sure that parents feel that they can give that free time for children to roam outside their neighbourhoods, because children really are, we talked about levelling up, and yes, it's about economic investment, but it's also that kind of sense of connectivity and civic pride and civic activity. And children are often the social glue. That's why parents come together, because of the activities that the children are doing. So it's also about creating time and places for children.
Absolutely. And what a lovely emotional point to end on. Anyone who's been to France or Spain on their holidays will know very different attitudes, or Norway, where they have hardly any children in prison, which is the fact of the day. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Patrick, Rachel, David, Abby, and Ryan, for this great event. Sorry to have overrun slightly. Thank you so much to the audience as well. And have a great rest of conference.